You know, every now and then you see a post online that just stops you cold. It's not really a joke. It's more like a diagnosis, like someone put a name to a feeling you didn't even know you had. Well, today we're going to dive into one of those. A single sentence that honestly just nails this deep collective anxiety about the world we've all been handed.
Okay, here it is. Kind of a bummer to have been born at the very end of the fuck-around century just to live the rest of my life in the find-out century. Wow. See, this isn't just some clever meme. The analysis we're looking at today says this is that sharp sting of recognition for a whole generation that's inheriting a world just full of consequences. Think about it. The F-around century, that was a time of just relentless expansion and extraction with nobody really keeping track of the tab. But now? Now we're living in the find-out century. And yeah, the bill is definitely coming due.
So to really get why this feeling is so potent, so real, we got to look at the numbers. We need to actually see the concrete, tangible decline in what life looks like from one generation to the next. Because this isn't just some vague feeling of doom and gloom. Oh no, it is a cold, hard economic reality.
And this table, it just lays it all out with brutal clarity. You look at the boomers, housing was affordable, the job market was pretty stable. A single income could often support an entire family. For Gen X, things were still, mostly okay. But then, look at that slide. For millennials, housing suddenly becomes this machine for transferring wealth upwards. And by the time you get to Gen Z, whoa, we're talking about sky-high rent and this precarious gig economy as just the default, the new normal. And here's a really crucial point from the source material we're looking at. This didn't just happen. This wasn't bad luck. It was the predictable result of decades of very specific policy choices. Things like turning housing into a financial asset instead of a human right, or gutting the power of unions. All of it systematically pushed risk away from big institutions and squarely onto the shoulders of individuals. It was, in a way, by design.
So all of this brings us to a pretty big question, right? We've sort of defined the economic anxiety, the why it feels this way, but what about the nature of the crises themselves? What are we actually facing? Because as it turns out, not all problems are the same.
And to answer that, the analysis gives us this really powerful way to think about it, a tool for diagnosing our reality. It basically splits our challenges into two completely different buckets. So here's the framework: locked in versus contingent. Locked-in consequences are the things that are, they're already baked into the cake. Physically or ecologically, they are going to happen no matter what we do now. Contingent consequences, on the other hand, are the ones where the outcome is still very much up for grabs. It all depends on what we do next. And just making this one distinction, it really helps us move past that vague sense of dread into something way more specific and useful. And this slide just illustrates it perfectly. Over on the left, you've got the locked-in stuff. Passing the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming mark, that's pretty much gone. The massive demographic shifts we're seeing, that's happening. And the source material says the right way to deal with these things isn't false hope, it's about adaptation and, frankly, grief. But then on the right, you have the contingent issues, things like how AI will displace jobs or whether our democracies will hold. These are the things that demand urgent, focused action right now, because the second we start treating them like they're inevitable, that's how they become inevitable. And when it comes to those locked-in crises, the analysis is just incredibly blunt. The time for preventing them, that's over. The window has closed. We are now, officially, in the business of consequence management.
Okay, but it gets even more complicated. What happens when a new crisis, a contingent one, suddenly explodes, and it makes managing those locked-in problems we already have almost impossible? Well, the source walks us through a pretty sobering and, frankly, all too real scenario. So the analysis asks us to imagine this. It's April 2026. A geopolitical flashpoint ignites, say, airstrikes on Iran. The response is immediate and catastrophic. Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, just closes it.
And the immediate impact of that one single move? 25%. A full quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade just stops. This isn't a small hiccup. The scenario describes it as the biggest supply shock in the history of the oil market. We're talking immediate worldwide energy emergencies.
But here's the real problem, the truly scary part. A crisis like this doesn't just add one more thing to our long list of worries. No, it actively destroys our ability to deal with everything else. It shatters the global cooperation we absolutely need to tackle climate change. It turns the very institutions we rely on for stability into weapons. That's what a compounding failure is. It's when a new crisis breaks the tools you were using to fix the old ones.
All right, so when you're faced with a picture this bleak, it's really easy to feel totally overwhelmed. But the analysis makes a really strong argument here. The point of all this is not to find some flimsy sense of hope, and it's definitely not to give in to despair. The whole point is to make an accurate diagnosis.
Because seeing the situation clearly, I mean really clearly, without trying to soften the blow, that's presented as the absolute first, most essential step. Think about it. You can't solve a problem you won't even describe properly. A doctor can't treat a wound they refuse to look at. This is all about working with what is, not what we wish was.
So, what does that actually look like in practice? What do we do? Well, the source lays out a sort of mandate for right now. First, stop waiting around for broken institutions to magically start working as designed. Second, start building power sideways through community networks and mutual aid. Third, tell the truth. The hard, unvarnished truth in every conversation and every space you can. And finally, and maybe this is the hardest one, keep looking. Refuse to look away from what's actually there.
And that, right there, is the big takeaway. That comforting, easy belief from the F-around century, the idea that, things will just sort themselves out. That belief is a huge part of what got us into this mess, because they didn't just work out. And so now, here in the find-out century, the real work starts. And it doesn't start with some magic bullet solution. It starts with something much harder, the courage to just tell the truth.
You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision.
No, absolutely.
Like it feels almost like engineering. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the black background, and the doctor just points to it and says, "There it is. There's the problem."
Right. It gives you a clear binary. Like
Right.
it's either broken or it's not.
Exactly.
And that gives us this immediate, actionable reality that we can, process and ideally fix.
Yeah, but then you step out of the clinic and into the world of global systems. You look at global economics or the climate or our social safety nets, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely useless. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is profoundly murky.
It's just a mess of overlapping variables.
It really is. And today, we are venturing into some incredibly deep, heavy waters. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a fascinating and honestly a rather overwhelming document provided by you, our listener.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's simply titled The Find Out Century.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to really unpack this document's core premise. Because the author makes a really compelling, if sobering, argument that humanity has definitively transitioned from an era of consequence-free resource extraction to an entirely new era of what they call consequence management.
Consequence management. Wow.
Right. So we're going to explore what it actually means, both psychologically and structurally, to navigate a world where the future is just arriving significantly faster than our systems can adapt to it.
And before we jump into the deep end here, we need to make something crystal clear for you listening. This document makes some very strong, highly charged political claims.
Very strong.
It covers U.S. domestic policy, global conflicts, the actions of both political left and the right, international relations, all of it. And we are not endorsing or taking sides on any of these viewpoints.
Right, we're totally neutral here.
Our job today is strictly to impartially unpack the ideas, the data, and the framing contained in the source material you've shared with us. We just want to fully understand the author's underlying argument and the systems they're pointing to.
Exactly. We are operating purely as a lens for the author's analysis today, just mapping out the causal chains they've identified in the text without, injecting our own political alignment.
Okay, let's unpack this. The document actually hooks you right at the beginning with the emotional core of this entire theory.
It's a great opening.
It really is. It references this viral social media post where someone essentially said that it's a cruel joke to have been born at the very end of the F-around century, only to have to live the rest of your entire life in the find-out century.
Yeah, that phrase really catches you.
And the author notes that a terrifying number of climate scientists, economists, and sociologists were quietly sharing and confirming this exact sentiment. So what exactly defines the boundary between these two centuries?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the author defines the mechanics of the late 20th century up through the early 2000s. That was the era of F-around.
Right.
And it was characterized by unprecedented, aggressive resource extraction, sweeping financial deregulation, massive atmospheric carbon emissions, and this unbounded, almost utopian technological optimism.
Everyone thought the party would just go on forever.
Exactly. But the crucial mechanism that defined that era was a massive lag in the feedback loop.
Meaning the bill simply hadn't come due yet.
Right.
Like you could pump carbon into the air or strip away financial regulations, and the catastrophic results wouldn't materialize for decades.
Precisely. The people making the decisions were completely insulated from the consequences of those decisions by the buffer of time.
Mm-hmm.
But today, the author argues, that temporal buffer is just gone. In the find-out century, the feedback loop is caught up to us. It's nearly instantaneous now.
So we're just living in the consequences.
Yeah, the inheritance of the current era is immediate climate instability, algorithmically manipulated information spaces, and an economy built on really precarious gig work.
Which is why the scientists were sharing that post.
Exactly. The author points out that scientists sharing that viral post isn't hyperbole. The ecological and physical models actually match that exact generational feeling of dread. Finding out isn't some moral punishment delivered from above, it's just the basic physics, ecology, and financial math finally playing themselves out.
To illustrate this, the document does this brutal step-by-step breakdown of housing and labor to prove this generational slide.
Oh, it's so bleak.
It really traces how the machinery of the economy shifted. It starts with the boomers, right?
Yeah.
The author notes they entered a workforce where pensions were standard, where a single income could buy a 3-bedroom house and support a family.
Though the author does make a very necessary caveat there.
Right, right.
That incredible labor market was exclusively for those who are allowed to participate.
Because of redlining and discrimination.
Exactly. Systemic racial redlining, overt gender discrimination, and a total lack of disability accommodations meant that this golden age of the single-income household was highly restricted. But for those inside the bubble, the economic floor was remarkably solid.
And then we move to Generation X, and you can see the gears starting to shift.
Transition phase.
Yeah, the corporate pensions start disappearing, replaced by market-dependent 401ks. The risk is basically transferred from the corporation to the individual. But the author notes, housing was still mostly treated as shelter, and you could theoretically still pay state college tuition by working a summer job.
Which sounds completely wild now.
It really does, because then Generation Y, the millennials, hit the job market right as the 2008 financial system collapses. Student debt explodes into a $1 trillion crisis. And this is the pivot point where the author says housing fully transitioned into a wealth transfer machine.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that concept of a wealth transfer machine requires us to look at the mechanics of the housing market.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, housing stopped being primarily a commodity for shelter and became a primary asset class.
Right. An investment.
Exactly. When a necessity like shelter becomes an investment vehicle, the current owners are financially incentivized to restrict new supply, right? They need to ensure their asset appreciates.
So they fight against new housing.
You end up in a scenario where people are essentially forced to live inside their stock portfolio. They literally cannot afford for the value of their neighborhood to drop, which forces them to vote against affordable housing developments or zoning changes that would actually help the next generation.
Which leads directly into the bleak reality for Generation Z. For them, rent isn't just high, it requires an unsustainable percentage of their income.
Yeah.
The norm isn't building a 30-year career, it's surviving on precarious work. It's the gig economy, 0-hour contracts, living with your parents into your late 20s or 30s.
And then there's Generation Alpha.
Oh man, Generation Alpha. The kids in school right now, the projections in this document for them are just chilling. You have AI systems poised to wipe out entry-level white-collar work before they even graduate, and that's layered on top of regional displacement from climate change.
It's a compounding crisis.
You know, hearing it laid out mechanically like that, it sounds like a multi-generational game of Monopoly.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like the first players circled the board, bought all the available property, built hotels on every single space, and then just handed the dice to the newest generation saying, good luck paying rent.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the author's argument. And what the author stresses heavily is that this generational slide was not an accident of history.
It wasn't just bad timing.
No, it wasn't bad luck at all. It was the predictable mathematical output of an economic system actively optimizing for asset holder returns at the direct expense of wage earners.
Wow.
Every major policy inflection point over the last 50 years, deregulating housing markets, shifting the burden of retirement to self-directed stock accounts, eroding collective bargaining rights. It was a deliberate choice. And those choices were made mostly by people who were already housed already employed, and already protected.
Which is just devastating when you think about it.
The author actually argues that Generation Alpha's bleak inheritance is the literal residue of extraction by prior generations.
Which brings a completely different moral weight to the situation. If it's just bad luck, you dust yourself off and adapt.
Right.
But if it's systematic extraction, that creates a deep societal wound. If the system was built intentionally to extract wealth, reversing it isn't just about passing a new law. You hit a wall of physics, math, and vested interests.
Yeah, you hit the ratchet.
Let's look at the things the author says we simply cannot undo.
This brings us to what I consider the sharpest analytical tool in the entire document. The author insists we cannot view the current everything crisis as a waiting queue of problems we'll eventually get around to fixing.
Mm-hmm.
It is a ratchet. It only turns one way. So to navigate this century, the author argues we must brutally divide our reality into two strict categories.
Yeah.
What is locked in versus what is contingent.
Okay, let's walk through the locked-in category, and I'll warn you listening, this list is incredibly heavy.
It really is. The author states unequivocally that the international target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is gone.
Wait.
It's not at risk. It is physically impossible to achieve now.
Hold on. We've spent the last decade, maybe longer, acting like 1.5 degrees is the finish line we have to sprint toward. Every climate summit, every corporate pledge is built around that number.
Right.
If the author is saying that's physically impossible now, that changes the entire framework of the environmental movement.
Well, it comes down to the physics, right? The author points to the thermal inertia of the oceans and the thawing permafrost. Like, the carbon that is already baked into the atmosphere doesn't care about our election cycles or corporate pledges.
The physics don't care.
Exactly. We are no longer trying to prevent the crisis. We are now purely in an era of consequence management. That is the ratchet turning.
Yeah.
And second on the lockdown list is the sixth mass extinction, which is currently underway at 100 to 1,000 times the background rate.
That's just hard to even process.
It is. Species and complex ecosystems do not magically reassemble on 4-year policy timelines once they collapse. That loss is locked in.
The document also puts the demographic pyramid in that locked-in category.
Yes, it does.
Talk to me about the math there, because that feels like something we usually treat as an economic issue, not a physical law.
Well, think about how 20th century social contracts were actually designed. Programs like public pensions, Social Security, elder care, they relied on a standard demographic pyramid.
A wide base at the bottom.
Right. A massive base of young, healthy workers paying taxes to support a relatively small tip of retirees at the top. But today, that pyramid has inverted across almost all wealthy nations.
So it's upside down.
Exactly. You have a massive aging population requiring intensive health care, supported by a shrinking base of young workers who, as we discussed, are already drowning in gig economy wages and high rent.
Wow.
You cannot fix that mathematical ratio with short-term policy. You can't instantly create a new generation of 25-year-old taxpayers.
Right, you can't just legislate people into existence.
Exactly. Furthermore, the financialization of housing is locked in, because fixing it would require intentionally crashing the property values of the voting bloc that holds all the wealth.
Which no politician is going to do.
No. And finally, the author stresses that AI displacement of cognitive labor isn't some sci-fi future scenario. It is happening right now, hollowing out the middle class.
Okay, so if that massive wall of crises is completely locked in, what is in the contingent category? What does the author think is still barely avoidable?
So the contingent items are structural and political. The author lists building a universal basic income floor before massive violent social unrest hits, partially decommodifying housing, taking some housing stock out of the speculative market, saving democratic institutions from sliding into authoritarianism, and crucially, finding a way to channel all this massive ecological and economic grief into community mutual aid rather than violent scapegoating.
So these are social choices.
Yes. Those are policy and social questions, not laws of physics.
Yeah.
They're genuinely contingent, but the window to act on them is closing incredibly fast.
I have to push back here on behalf of you, the listener, because the author explicitly writes that hope is the wrong response to the locked-in realities and that we need grief and triage. Isn't that just a recipe for total despair?
It sounds like it, initially.
Right. The document notes the author actually works as an employment counselor. How do you look across a desk and tell a human being that their entire industry is permanently gone without completely breaking their spirit?
Well, this raises an important question about human psychology, and the author addresses this directly from their experience on the ground. They argue that grieving the locked-in realities, like fully accepting them without the crutch of false hope, is the strict precondition for fighting for the contingent ones.
Oh, I see.
If you apply a sedative of, don't worry, it will all bounce back, you are actively preventing that person from adapting.
You can't triage a wound if you refuse to look at the bleeding.
Exactly the author's point. They call it diagnosis, not despair. Telling an employment client the blunt truth about an automated job market isn't designed to break them. It's to stop them from wasting their rapidly dwindling savings and time preparing for a world that literally no longer exists.
That makes a lot of sense.
Accurate, unflinching diagnosis is the only place where real survival work can actually begin.
Okay, so if we have this locked-in reality, and our only path forward is to aggressively manage these massive consequences, who is doing the managing?
Well, that's the scary part.
Because the document includes this stark update from April 2026 that shows the global institutions we desperately need to handle these crises are actively dismantling themselves. And just a quick reminder to you listening, we are impartially reporting the source's extremely harsh, specific lens on global politics here.
Right. And the author argues that the compounding tragedy of the find-out century isn't just new crises layering on top of old ones. It's the active, deliberate destruction of the preconditions for response.
The preconditions for response.
Yeah. The international architecture that could theoretically organize a response to global climate migration or global AI guidelines is fracturing under nationalist pressure.
How does the author trace that fracture mechanically? Like, where does it start?
They start with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Beyond the devastating human toll, the author notes this event fundamentally shattered the post-1945 global norm against territorial conquest by major military powers.
Because for 80 years, that was the rule, right?
Yeah, exactly. For 80 years, the underlying rule of the global order was that you couldn't just erase a neighbor's borders with a tank army. Now, the author argues that norm is broken, which suddenly makes the threat of violent annexation viable everywhere else on the globe.
And the document does not hold back on the United States either. It explicitly characterizes the U.S. not as a flawed leader, but as a rogue state.
The text cites severe domestic and international actions to justify that specific label.
Like what?
It points to Immigration and Customs Enforcement IC conducting mass raids and disappearing people into detention centers, as well as deportations without due process to El Salvador's CECOT mega prison.
And human rights organizations classify that prison as a site of systematic, industrialized torture, right?
They do, yes. It also points to Donald Trump acting with dictatorial ambition, openly threatening to annex or assert control over Greenland, Canada, and Venezuela.
Just threatening neighbors.
Right. The mechanism the author highlights is that the U.S., which historically provided the economic and military backbone for international legal frameworks, is now structurally weaponized against those very frameworks.
The document also addresses the situation in Gaza.
It does, and it deliberately uses definitive legal terminology. The source describes the situation in Gaza as a genocide, citing over 50,000 dead, the calculated use of starvation as a weapon of war, and the systematic destruction of medical infrastructure.
And structurally, how does that tie into the failing institutions?
Well, structurally, the author points out that the U.S. has repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire.
Okay.
The author argues that a UN veto isn't just a political stance, it's a mechanical failure of the system. It effectively renders the primary institution designed to prevent genocide structurally incapable of doing its job.
So what does this all mean? If we go back to our earlier ideas, if the locked-in climate and economic issues are a raging house fire, this 2026 update makes it sound like the fire department hasn't just been delayed. The fire department has been entirely disbanded, the hoses have been cut, and the neighbors are outside setting off fireworks into the dry brush.
That analogy captures the author's dread perfectly, because the loss of these institutions means that when a sudden, massive shock hits an already overstressed system, there are absolutely zero shock absorbers left to prevent a freefall.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean incredibly alarming.
Yeah.
That fireworks metaphor leads directly into the most explosive, immediate crisis documented in the text. The cascading effects of global war and the breaking of the global supply chain, specifically starting on February 28th, 2026.
The author details a massive geopolitical event labeled Operation Epic Fury.
Operation Epic Fury.
According to the text, The U.S. and Israel launched coordinated, massive airstrikes against Iran, targeting military installations and nuclear sites, which ultimately resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader.
So a massive escalation.
The author notes this wasn't a defensive posture, it was a decapitation strike against the sovereign government.
And the immediate retaliation from Iran is to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is the absolute choke point for the global physical economy.
How much actually goes through there?
The text points out that roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of liquefied natural gas passes through that narrow physical strait. When that closes, the author traces a terrifying, immediate cascade of failures.
It starts with energy, right?
Yes. The Philippines immediately declares a national energy emergency. Fuel crunches hit Asia, spreading westward to Europe, which faces crippling diesel shortages within weeks.
The document notes that global GDP could drop by nearly 3 percentage points annualized just from that.
Just from the initial shock.
But the cascade doesn't stop at energy or stock markets. This is where we have to look at the mechanics of how the world actually feeds itself.
Right. If we look at the chemistry of modern survival, we have to talk about the Haber-Bosch process.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So, modern agriculture relies entirely on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to grow enough food for 8 billion people.
Oh.
To make that fertilizer, you need massive amounts of natural gas.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Yeah. When the Strait of Hormuz closes and LNG prices spike astronomically, fertilizer plants around the world simply cannot afford to operate. So they shut down.
Wow.
A fuel crisis in February mechanically guarantees a fertilizer shortage in April, which guarantees a catastrophic collapse in crop yields in September.
And the author fiercely points out the brutal injustice of this interconnected system. The poorest households in the Philippines, Pakistan, and India, people who have virtually zero carbon footprint and no say in Middle Eastern geopolitics, they are the very first to run out of cooking gas. And months later, they're the very first to face outright starvation.
The author compares this specific geopolitical flashpoint to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. But they argue that we're not just closer to World War III than we were back then. They argue this 2026 reality is actually structurally more dangerous.
I have to ask why. Because 1962 was a literal, direct nuclear standoff between two superpowers. How could this be worse?
Well, the author's reasoning is based on the collapse of systemic stability and institutional guardrails. In 1962, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, despite all their flaws and the massive tension, fundamentally understood and respected deterrence theory.
They didn't actually want the world to end.
Right. They had established lines of communication, they had military advisors they actually listened to, and they operated within institutional constraints. In 2026, the text argues, leaders are operating almost entirely on vanity, wounded pride, and transactional logic.
It's all ego and transactions.
Exactly. You have a scenario where a U.S. president might demand NATO intervene to reopen the strait while simultaneously threatening to dismantle NATO if member nations don't pay up.
The author calls it unpredictability at nuclear scale.
The epistemic quality of decision-making is drastically lower. The institutional guardrails we talked about earlier are gone. And this is the critical, terrifying difference from 1962. The underlying baseline systems of climate, food production, and energy are already massively stressed.
So the foundation is already crumbling.
Exactly. In 1962, the world was stable, and the missiles were the anomaly. In 2026, the fire is already burning everywhere when the match is dropped.
Okay, so we have traversed a deeply intense, almost overwhelming landscape today. We've moved from the slow, deliberate, generational slide of wealth extraction to the locked-in physics of climate change and demographics, all the way to a hypothetical global supply chain collapse triggered by broken institutions in April 2026.
It's a lot to take in.
We need to synthesize the author's ultimate thesis here. If the X-ray shows all these broken bones, how do we actually live in the find-out century?
The overarching final takeaway from the author is the absolute necessity of working with what is.
Working with what is?
That means aggressively stripping away hope when it functions merely as a sedative to keep you compliant. It means telling the uncomfortable truth in your professional and personal life, admitting which jobs are never coming back, accepting that the international legal order is substantially dismantled, and honestly, grieving those losses.
The author says the most important survival skill now is learning how to navigate radical, daily uncertainty with your nervous system intact.
Yes, because if you are sitting around waiting for top-down institutions, governments, the UN, massive corporations to function as they were designed and swoop in to save us, you will be waiting forever.
They're just not coming.
They aren't going to. The author's final argument is that we must start building laterally.
Building laterally, meaning community by community, mutual aid network by mutual aid network.
And the author is very clear. This is not some romantic, utopian alternative to capitalism.
Yeah.
They advocate for lateral building because, as the text starkly states, it is the actual available ground right now.
Wow.
When the vertical systems collapse, the lateral systems are the only place left to stand.
The source insists that building lateral, community-level networks is the only actual ground we have left to stand on. It makes you wonder, deeply, if the massive top-down institutions we rely on completely for our food, our energy, and our security are as permanently compromised and fragile as this document suggests. What practical skills or community relationships do you currently possess that are completely independent of those systems?
Yeah.
If the find-out century is already here and the vertical pillars are shaking, who exactly is in your lateral network today?